Mr. President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this exceptional event in HAIGAZIAN University's 50th anniversary celebrations. 2 years ago, while we were having a meeting with the United States Public Office in Beirut, the question was asked, if you had the chance to invite an American scholar to Lebanon and to HAIGAZIAN for a couple of days, who would you choose? Our immediate response was Peter Balakian. Why? Well, we said, first of all, he's a prominent professor of American literature and poetry at Colgate University, New York. Furthermore, his book entitled Black Dog of Fate is a required reading in the Intercultural Studies program at HAIGAZIAN. What greater treat for our students than to discuss and debate a text with the author himself? But there are also other reasons, more of a historical, cultural, and emotional nature, that tie Balakian to HAIGAZIAN. 90 years ago, at the dawn of the 20th century, the first genocide of the century was perpetrated against the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire, during which more than 1.5 million Armenians perished. Among the victims was a young schoolmaster, a PhD graduate from Yale University, who had returned from the United States with the dream of teaching his compatriots about the values he had learned in his college. His name was Armenag HAIGAZIAN. It was in his memory that the descendants of this great man erected this university to serve as an eternal flame dedicated to the education and empowerment of young generations of the Middle East. Yes, many perished, but many also survived, as we can see from the audience, thanks to providence, human relief organizations, perseverance, and goodwill. These survivors traveled all over the world to form what is known today as the Armenian diaspora. Among these pioneer fighters was an amazing young lady called Nafina Arusyan, grandmother of Peter Balakian, who immigrated and settled in the United States. It is in memory of the Nafinas and the HAIGAZIAN'S of this world that Peter Balakian wrote his 2 award-winning books dedicated as a tribute to the Armenian genocide. Since tonight's lecture is about growing up in New Jersey, which is more of a personal biography, I will just zoom on some of the highlights of Peter Balakian's prestigious CV. Prize-winning memoirist, poet, scholar, Peter Balakian is the Donald M. and Constant H. Rebar Professor of the Humanities and Professor of English at Colgate University, New York. He holds a BA from Bucknell University and a PhD in American Civilization from Brown University. He is the author of 8 books, including the most recent, Burning Tigris, A History of the Armenian Genocide, the memoir Black Dog of Fate, which I think would be mostly discussed tonight, and which won the 1998 PEN Martha Albrun Prize for the Art of the Memoir and was a New York Times notable book and Best Book of the Year for the Los Angeles Times and Publishers Weekly. His June 3 New and Selected Poems, 1974-2000, received critical acclaim in the New York Times Book Review and TLS. Balakian is also the author of a book on the American poet Theodore Roethke and the co-translator of the American poet Armenian poet Siamantos Bloody News from My Friend. Between 1976 and 96, he edited with Bruce Smith the poetry journal Graham House Review. He is the recipient of honors and awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Anahit Literary Prize, and the Ellis Island Medal of Honor. He has appeared widely on national television and radio, including ABC World News Tonight, The Charlie Rose Show, Terry Gross's Fresh Air, NPR's Weekend Edition, CNN, and foreign editions of his work have appeared throughout Europe. We are grateful to the United States Embassy in Beirut for hosting this prominent scholar and giving the Lebanese public a chance of benefiting from his presence and expertise. We are also indebted to Peter Balakian for gracing HAIGAZIAN University with his presence and finding time for us amid his hectic schedule. After this lecture, there will be a reception in the Mughar Garden where his books will be available for sale and the author will sign his books. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Peter Balakian for his first lecture tonight on trauma and growing up in New Jersey suburbs. Tomorrow's lecture will be on the Armenian genocide and America's first international human rights movement in this same hall. Thank you. Please.
Thank you so very much. There's so many people to thank. Let me put my water down. So many people to thank for getting me here. The U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Ken Jones, Maggie Teen, Juliet Wurr, thank you for running interference for me. President and Mrs. HAIGAZIAN, thank you so much for your warm welcome and hospitality. And Dean of the Faculty, Arda Ekmeci, thank you for all you've done. For months now, we've been talking about the details, and the Dean of the Faculty here has done so very much to make my visit possible, and her generous hospitality and embrace are much appreciated on my first visit to Beirut. It's a true honor to be here with you. And I'm going to echo what the Dean just noted as well. It's in my prepared comments. 90 years ago, how can we not have that in our frame of mind? 90 years ago, much of the world thought the Armenian people were vanquished, gone, obliterated. The young Turk government of the Ottoman Empire had massacred, starved, and exiled almost every Armenian living then in what is today Turkey. But after the genocide, one of the first places in the world where an extraordinary diaspora grew up was here in Lebanon, with Beirut as its cultural center. In some ways, I feel I can't come any closer to Western Armenia and its great cultural legacy than being here. For me to be here with you is also to be close to the legacy of those leading Western Armenian cultural figures of 1915, many of whom perished in the genocide. And so HAIGAZIAN continues that Armenian intellectual and academic tradition. I know it was born out of the dream of higher education of three Armenian Americans, Steve and Mary Mehagian and Stephen Filibosian. I'm happy to be friends with the daughter of Stephen Filibosian, Joyce Filibosian-Stein, and her husband, Joe. They're wonderful, wonderful people. I know many of you know them. And out of a deep Armenian Protestant evangelical tradition, HAIGAZIAN has clearly evolved over half a century to be an important academic institution on the map of the Middle East, and of course on the Armenian map of the world. Its commitment to higher education and intellectual excellence to the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences also continues a great and ancient Armenian cultural tradition. HAIGAZIAN has become a place of nexus for scholars and writers, students and teachers of all cultures and religions, a truly multicultural institution in a multicultural country. And so I'm grateful and honored to be here with you for this jubilee, and I wish you decades and centuries of continued growth and achievement. What you've made happen in 50 years is extraordinary, and I'm sure what you'll make happen in the next 50 will even be more extraordinary. And it seems to me, too, so deeply that HAIGAZIAN embodies the spirit of Armenian intellectual vitality and the power of rebirth. Now, for lecture one tonight, I'm going to talk about my memoir, Black Dog of Fate. And yes, that reminds me, if you do have cell phones, please take them off. I want to talk for 45 minutes, maybe 48 minutes, about dimensions of my memoir, Black Dog of Fate, and then I want to open the floor for conversation, because what matters to me is also getting to know you as a community and having conversation with you. I want to tell you that it's truly exciting for me to be here in Beirut. This is the beginning of my journey to the Middle East, and Lebanon is such an extraordinary country with such an ancient culture, so many traditions, and such extraordinary beauty. So I want to talk with you as much as we can after this conversation. Let me start by saying this, that my work obviously comes out of the American zone into the Armenian zone. The two are inseparable for me. And I want to start, and I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow as well, but I want to let you know that the Armenian genocide as a subject, as a discourse, is a hot subject in the United States. It is being taught across our vast nation, in high schools, colleges, graduate schools, middle schools. It is being taught as part of the mainstream curriculum. I'm talking about Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, New Orleans, Cleveland, Boston, and so forth. And we can talk more about that. But I want to, in some sense, frame my memoir as an American book, as a piece of American literature, as well as a piece of Armenian diasporan literature. It's been embraced in the United States as a piece of American literature, and that has helped it get into the mainstream curriculum, which has surprised me and, of course, delighted me. My focus tonight is on the issue of the transmission of trauma across generations. It seems to me, finally, that's what my memoir is about, in the broadest sense. Why is that so important? Obviously, because trauma is the long aftermath of the catastrophe. It is the articulate life of the past. It's how the past lives on in us, personally, and in us collectively. William Faulkner, the great American novelist, once said, "The past isn't over, it isn't even past." And I'm sure many of you in this room can testify to the meaning of that. So everything I say tonight in my exploration of aspects of Black Dog of Fate will come back to the whole business of the transmission of trauma across generations. Keep that idea in your heads as the central engine to what I'm trying to suggest. I like to put it this way. In my book, there's the outside and the inside. And I want to note that on the outside, the Balakians, and you see, I'm sad to say, we flattened the A in America. We go by Balakian, although I'm happy to answer to Balakian because it's the right thing, isn't it? The Balakians of Teaneck and Tenafly, New Jersey, small suburbs right outside of New York City. right over the George Washington Bridge, if some of you have been there. Affluent, beautiful, sunny suburbs. The Balakians of Teaneck and Tenafly, New Jersey, were very mainstream Americans. We're in the 1950s and 60s. They were very mainstream Americans. My father was a physician. He left the house every day in his dark Brooks Brothers suit and his starched white shirt with his medical bag and his Stetson hat, got into his Chevy or Buick and drove off to his office, his medical practice 5 minutes away. My mother, I would say, was a good mom, 1950s style. She had a college degree. She had a BS in chemistry from Bucknell University, the school that I later went to. And after she got married, she stayed home and she worked. And you'll find her in my story in a 1957 pink and white Chevy station wagon. Is that something that can ring a bell with you? A pink and white Chevy station wagon. It was sort of a mauve color, actually. And you'll find us always in it. The four of us, my brother, my two sisters, myself, we're being driven to baseball games, birthday parties, tennis matches, the country club, and so forth, if you get the picture. The mother always hovering over everything, controlling everything, and so forth. You'll find my mother in that mode. Popular culture, rock and roll, American sports dominated my growing up. I started playing what we call in the state Little League baseball, football, basketball from the time I was 5 or 6. When I went off to college, I was a recruited athlete. I was a running back on the American football team. I was a shortstop on the baseball team. I'm happy to say I quit a year into it all and got into some more serious things. But for the first 18 years of my life, really, it was sports, 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 and popular music, rock and roll, Elvis Presley, the Beach Boys, the Beatles, the girl groups of the early 1960s. This may or may not mean anything to you, but the Shirelles, the Ronettes, the Crystals, I mention their names because my grandmother, Nafina Arusian, a genocide survivor, whose life I'll tell you about in a few minutes, was a great fan of rock and roll. She loved Elvis Presley. She loved Fats Domino. She could sing the lyrics, and she rooted deeply for baseball, especially the New York Yankees. There was something about the winning ways of the New York Yankees that appealed to a genocide survivor. I kid you not. Okay, so that's a brief sketch of the outside. But when you came back to our house, a 1960 neo-colonial suburban house at 57 Crabtree Lane in Tenafly, New Jersey, and closed the door, something else was going on inside. Inside, things Armenian, decidedly Armenian, were happening. First, of course, were the artifacts in the house. A house is a text, is it not? And its artifacts tell us so much about it. What self-respecting Armenian house would not have fine Oriental carpets? Ours did, of course. And you have to understand that everybody else in the neighborhood on our suburban block had indoor-outdoor shag carpet, white carpet and so forth. And that's what I wanted us to have. But no, of course, we had good kashans and saruks and so forth. We had beautiful European porcelain and artifacts around the house. Like, what was that mother of pearl cross that Archbishop Nersoyan had brought back from Jerusalem to us? What was that doing hanging over the hi-fi, the stereo, in the living room? Or a framed Toros Roslin illuminated manuscript next to the dartboard in the den. Those things always interested me. I never asked too many questions about them, but there they were. Obviously, the language. It's with great embarrassment I confess to you that my Armenian is so poor that I won't try to speak it with you. I just know fragments. I never learned the language properly or fully. And I write a little bit about that in my memoir. But of course, everybody in the older generation spoke Armenian. My mother, my father, aunts, uncles, grandmother. And that beautiful, at once intimate and yet exotic language floated around our house like an archipelago of sounds. And of course, kids have good ears, so things got stuck in my ear, and I picked up pieces and bits of Western Armenian, and I put those pieces and bits in the narrative of my memoir so that my American audience could taste it a little bit, get a little flavor for it. My parents spoke Armenian as a private language when they didn't want us to know what they were saying. I know that must seem very strange to all of you, and looking back at it, I find it strange too. And then there's the business of food, because food is such a text as well, it's such a script. We know that history is transmitted in the kitchen, that the generations of continuity come together in recipes. Now, my mother, who's still living and very vigorous, is a terrific cook, and I'm not saying that sentimentally. Some mothers aren't good cooks. Most Armenian women are good cooks, something in our culture. But my mother's a terrific cook, and I learned quite early on in life that the Balakian chemistry was ruled by my mother's kitchen. And that is to say, in suburbia, in America, people would come, my friends on the block, as we say, on the street, would come home, they would eat dinner in 5 minutes, like a frozen hamburger on a grill, some potato puffs in the oven, a glass of Coke, and they'd run out on the street to play ball, to play games, whatever. In our house, dining was deliberate, ritualized, formal, and long, and protracted. My mother wouldn't cook fast food. She wouldn't allow fast food in the house. She wouldn't allow the American TV dinners. You know, TV dinners, is that something you know about? You know, have TV dinners? I grew up lusting after a TV dinner. And it was forbidden. You know, the little plastic food in the triangles and squares. My mother would be cooking, not every night something Armenian, but I would say 3 to 4 nights a week, half the week or more, she would be cooking Armenian. And that beautiful, aromatic, sensuous cuisine of Armenian culture would also waft around the house. You'd come home to those aromas, whether it was midya, yalanchi, kufta, summer dolma, whatever it was always brewing. And that defined something different about what was going on in the house. And then, of course, there were my grandmother's folk tales and dreams. Now, if some of you have read my memoir, you know that my memoir, in some sense, is informed, it's inflected by my grandmother's folk tales and dreams, and they would intrude on us at any time of day. She would all of a sudden start in, you know, Yavri, let me tell you this tale, let me tell you this parable. And so you'll find in reading my book, I hope, some interesting dimensions of Western Armenian folkloric imagination. So that's the sense of outside and inside, and that tension works throughout the book, I hope, you'll find. And you have to have tension to tell a good story. Now, another important part of this idea of the transmission of trauma across generations, and keep what I'm saying about outside and inside on the plate for a minute, and come over to this notion. At a certain point in my life, I came to understand that I had grown up in a family with a secret, okay? All families have secrets. I mean, secrecy is part of family pathology, is it not? At a certain point, you get old enough, or strong enough, or confident enough to go and open up this closet in your family past and see what skeletons are hanging in the closet. The secret, however, in my family, the thing that nobody could speak about openly, and I want to underline the word openly, was the history of the Armenian genocide, the experience of the family's past in that great inferno through which every Armenian passed in the second decade of the 20th century. That extermination of a whole culture, that deportation, massacre, exile, and starvation of the entire Ottoman Armenian world. And I will speak more in a few minutes about my grandmother's story. But that experience of the genocide was the thing that nobody in my family could speak about openly. But then what I came to see and realize was that no matter how hard they tried to repress the trauma of that past, they couldn't. That even there, in that sunny, affluent world of Tenafly, New Jersey, circa 1950s and early 1960s, the darkness of the past leaked through the sunlight. And I realized that I had grown up receiving what I have come to call encoded messages. And my memoir is really built out of those encoded messages, like hieroglyphs, like secrets in a bottle. Things were tossed at us here and there, every now and then. And you know, kids have great imaginations and memories, and we store them up as kids. We don't always ask the questions. Sometimes we're afraid to ask the questions. Or sometimes when we ask the questions, we're not given proper answers. People cut down the conversation. And you'll find that in part of my memoir, there's a lot of that truncated conversation. No full dialogue about this history. Everybody was too traumatized about it, and for complicated reasons, which we can talk about later. Nobody could talk openly. So through much of the book, you come to wrestle with the encoded messages about the trauma of the Armenian genocide, experience and its legacy. Now, in the second half of my book, you follow a young man, a young poet, because at this point I've left the football field for writing, for a serious life of writing, although the football field helped me a lot, still does. The second half of the book deals with a young poet's journey into history. If the first half is about all these frustrating hieroglyphs, the second half is about the drama of the search for the truth of history, of the history of the Armenian genocide, and the history of my family's experience. And I want to take you, the reader, into a dramatic engagement through reading, through unpeeling texts, if you will. I hope in the second half of Black Dog of Fate, the drama of reading becomes exciting. I always thought of it when I finished the memoir as sort of like unpeeling an onion. I started with Ambassador Morgenthau's story. I read it. It blew my mind. It filled in all the gaps. It gave me a narrative, that first great narrative in the English language to tell the story of the Armenian genocide to a wide audience. It was on my parents' bookshelf. I pulled it off. I began reading it. So there's Ambassador Morgenthau's story. And then I take you as a reader into other texts. Eyewitness accounts from a German businessman of the genocide. Eyewitness accounts of the genocide, a German businessman, a Swiss nurse, Protestant American missionaries in the killing fields, U.S. consular reports, and I'm going to talk a lot more about all of that tomorrow night when I talk about the history in a different way. And even some Turkish confessions, like the famous confession of General Vehib of the Third Ottoman Army, who at the court-martials in Constantinople in 1920 gave an extraordinary, articulate admission of how the plan to exterminate the Armenian people of the Ottoman Empire was implemented by the special organization of the Central Committee of the CUP. Again, more on that tomorrow night, but you'll find snippets of that in the second half of Black Dog of Fate. And you'll also find another document, and I think it's an extraordinary document. It's my grandmother's human rights suit of the Turkish government, which she filed through the United States State Department in 1920. Now let me, at this moment, just say something briefly about my, my grandmother. Dean Ekmechi mentioned Nafina Arusian, and she was an extraordinary woman. She was born in Dikranagert in 1890. The Turkish gendarmes pillaged her house. Her family, the HAIGAZIAN'S of Dikranagert, her maiden name Şekerlemedyen, her first married name Çilingurian, her second married name Arusyan. Her family were wealthy silk merchants with lots of land and holdings and lived quite well in Dikranagert. In the first week of August of 1915, the Turkish gendarmes pillaged their house and murdered everyone in her family, father, mother, sisters, brothers, nieces, nephews, everyone gone. She was at the summer house. She got lucky, escaped the massacre. She and her first husband and her two infant daughters, my aunts, now both deceased, Gladys and Alice, then Zivart and Arshalois, were put on a death march. And her first husband died on the march. She and her two infant daughters survived. And sometime in the fall of 1915, they arrived in Aleppo. And there, in the famine-ravaged refugee quarter of that city, my grandmother, a 25-year-old widow of the century's first genocide, stripped of everything, homeland, family, culture, everything near and close and dear to her, began to compile the affidavits for a human rights lawsuit against the Ottoman government, a major world power. She put the document together and she brought it with her to the United States when she arrived in New Jersey in 1920, and she filed it through the U.S. State Department's claims against foreign governments. It's an extraordinary document. Although nothing monetary came of it, it is an extraordinary act of witness, a testimony to what happened. And I'm happy to say that my publisher did a brilliant job reproducing the document in facsimile fashion in my memoir. And so you will find it, not the entire document, of course, but pieces of it. So you will find it very readable and very multi-layered, with its notarized seals from Aleppo in French, in Arabic, in Armenian, and the writing of the document is all in English. I assume it was translated, perhaps, or her English. No, I guess it was in her English. It was good enough because the English is the English of the inflection of somebody who's a new emigre. So you will find my grandmother's document in a whole chapter of Black Dog of Fate. Perhaps it's a document that still is alive. Now, the very last part of my memoir deals with yet one further journey into this complex historical legacy. It deals with the issue of commemoration, memory, and denial. And I know that many of you follow the Turkish government's ongoing propaganda campaign to deny, cover up, coerce, and blackmail foreign governments into suppressing and colluding with its denial. Scholars have agreed worldwide that this is unique in the annals of modern history. It's a scandal, it's a kind of extraordinary corruption, and I think the good news is it's really not working very well anymore, almost anywhere. A few State Departments, yes, the denial is still operating on them. I think more, not so much out of the denial on the parts of the State Departments, the US, Great Britain, somewhat Germany. There's fear. It's fear of Turkey. But I think that the moral courage can be summoned to deal with this in the near future. So the last part of my book deals with this issue, and I would remind you all what scholars of genocide say worldwide, that the denial of genocide is the final stage of genocide, because it seeks to demonize the victims and rehabilitate the perpetrators, and because it sends the message that genocide doesn't matter, that it demands no moral accountability. Elie Wiesel has used the term double killing, and he's used it very particularly about the horror of Turkish denial. It's a double killing because it robs the victim culture, it attempts to rob the victim culture of its memory, and it also attempts to create a counterfeit universe, a false universe. My book deals with these issues, and you can extrapolate from my book ends in 1997, and it ends in American universities where the Turkish government has tried to insert paid deniers into endowed chairs in places as distinguished as Princeton University, where there was a big scandal over a man named Heath Lowry. And I got involved in that scandal, and I write about that here as well. I didn't think I was going to end my book in such a political way, but life happened to me, and I thought, well, yes, it makes sense. The journey takes me here. So I leave you with those remarks on the transmission of trauma idea. And now I want to come to my memoir and read two vignettes that may dramatize some of the way the encoded messages came down to me. Scene one, I want to read to you, happens early in the book. It's set in October of 1962, an autumn that was defined in the United States by the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you were my age in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was, it wasn't just frightening for a 10-year or 11-year-old, it was frightening for everybody. People really thought about the end of the world constantly in 1962. I can remember coming home from school and asking my parents, is it over? Khrushchev and Kennedy were talking about, nuclear weapons and nuclear attack, and this was the atmosphere. Another thing that dominated the atmosphere of 1962 was the New York Yankees San Francisco Giants World Series. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details of that World Series because it probably won't mean much to you. But I do want to note it because the Yankees won, and that meant a lot to my grandmother and to me. And I suppose in the United States, sports are sort of a drug that takes your mind off fear and scary things. That's probably true in every country in the world. Sports are a kind of great escape, a great drug. So here we are in autumn of 1962 in my house at 57 Crabtree Lane, Tenafly, New Jersey. I went home disgusted and secretly terrified by the whole Cuba. And you remember in the United States, the Cuban Missile Crisis was centered around the problem the U.S. was having with Cuba. I went home each day in late October, disgusted and secretly terrified by the whole Cuba business. I went home each day in late October after playing football, ate dinner, and opened the door for my grandmother and followed her into the TV room to watch the images of aircraft carriers and Cuba on the screen. I lay in bed one night sweating, filled with images of bomb shelters and cereal in metal containers, and decided to go downstairs for a bowl of Frosted Flakes. I know you have Frosted Flakes here in Beirut. I saw them at the hotel this morning. And bomb shelters. Does this ring a bell? That we were actually building these shelters underground where we were going to hide when the bomb was dropped. My parents refused to do this, by the way. Probably Armenian wisdom. Okay, went downstairs for a bowl of Frosted Flakes. As I passed the partly opened door to the TV room, I noticed that my grandmother was watching the late-night news. Just as I was about to fling the door open, she took a long ivory pipe out of her purse, filled it with tobacco, and lit up. I was so startled that I stood frozen in the dark hallway, watching her through the 2-inch crack between the door and the door jamb. I could hear Kennedy, Khrushchev, Castro, Cuba from the newscaster's voice.
My grandmother drew long puffs on the pipe, put it down on the coffee table, and then made the sign of the cross and said some Armenian words. Dervohormia, Dervohormia, Dervohormia. Then she crossed herself again, took a puff on her pipe, and said, Surp Astvads, Surp Astvads. She stood up, crossed herself, sat down, and pulled from her purse a dazzling blue and ivory striped cloth. She placed it on her lap like a napkin and then opened up a big fat biography of Mary Todd Lincoln in which a '57 baseball card of Hank Aaron was tucked as a bookmark. For days afterward, I thought of my grandmother's strange ritual in the TV room, because I felt guilty for spying on her while everyone else slept peacefully upstairs. I couldn't mention it to anyone. Weeks later, after the Cuban Missile Crisis was settled, and enough time had passed so that what I had seen seemed like fiction, I told my grandmother that one night in the summer I had seen Gran take a smoke on a pipe. Seeing on my face that this amazed and somewhat frightened me, she said, "Oh, in the old country at a certain age, women smoke pipes once in a while. It's a sign of wisdom." If I was relieved that my mother had given me an answer, I was unsettled that the answer had unfurled more questions. The old country, that phrase that came up now and then, a phrase that seemed to have a lock on it. I knew it meant Armenia, but it made me uneasy. If I asked about the old country, the adults would change the subject. Once my mother said, "It's an ancient place, it's not really around anymore." Where had it gone? I asked myself. If I lived in a house where the old country still had a presence, why wasn't there a map or photograph or beautiful drawing of it somewhere, like the one the Zandanellas had of Milan in their TV room? Since there was no picture of the old country in our house, and since I didn't have one etched in my mind, the old country came to mean my grandmother. Whatever it was, she was. Whatever she was, it was. Now, in this next scene takes place during my discovery of Ambassador Morgenthau's story. You know how it is, you pick up a book one day and it changes your life? And you know, in your home, everybody's home has a library or a wall of books, a shelf of books. And as kids, you look at those books all the time. They're your parents' library. You're looking at the spines of those books all the time. I can still see that whole wall of books in my parents' house. You know, I don't know if these titles will mean anything to you. Like, well, I remember Armenian Folk Tales and Myths, the Saroyan Special, 2 Months in Tibet, Weight Loss with Jack LaLanne. And you know who's Jack LaLanne alive over here? He's a big fitness guy. And then there was this book called Ambassador Morgenthau's Story. Sort of faded orange writing on a brown spine, an old book. And that name always got into my ear, Morgenthau, interesting name. I didn't know it was a German Jewish name. I picked the book up. I was running to work. I was commuting to my summer job in downtown Manhattan, where I used to run. I was a mail boy and a runner for a shipping company way down at the tip of the island, and my job was to run checks. I had to get checks for $300,000 or $400,000 from one company into the bank before the day closed, because the interest you lost on a $300,000 check was no small thing. So they hired somebody, and here's my football training, help me with this, you know. So they hired somebody to do this check running around the city. And what I would try to do is make my runs very fast so I would have time to work on my poems and do reading, because at this point in my life I was committed to the life of making art and knowledge. And so here I am reading Ambassador Morgenthau's story. I'm reading that famous chapter, The Murder of a Nation, and I'm on a bench in a park way downtown in Manhattan, Battery Park. I sat on the bench sipping hot coffee out of a styrofoam cup. Well, actually, let me start a little earlier than that. Hold on. Okay, here's, let's get a little snippet. I'm reading the Morgenthau chapter, so let me give you a little snippet of it. This is from Morgenthau in that famous chapter, The Murder of a Nation. The central government now announced its intention of gathering the 2 million or more Armenians living in the several sections of the empire and transporting them to this desolate and inhospitable region, the Syrian desert. The real purpose of the deportation was robbery and destruction. It really represented a new method of massacre. When the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact. I sat on the bench sipping hot coffee out of a styrofoam cup and recalled something my grandmother told me when I was 10 as we sat alone on the patio after Sunday dinner. It was late summer because I remember the sound of the cicadas and the maples and how the whole yard sounded like a great shaking rattle. My grandmother sat reclined in a green and white chaise lounge drinking a glass of tan. She wore sunglasses, and all I could see was the hedge of the rhododendrons reflected in the dark plastic of her glasses. You know the one about the man who went to Constantinople to seek his fortune? She said. Nope, I said, hoping to indicate that I didn't want to know about the man who went to Constantinople. After he had been in Constantinople for a while, he heard about a man from his village who had also arrived. And because he had left behind his father, mother, brother, sister, and his dog named Manuk, he went to find the man from his village. He was led to a pastry shop where he noticed his fellow villager eating kadayif and drinking coffee. Haji Ovan, he cried as he walked into the pastry shop. Have you come from Bitlis? Yes, Haji Ovan said, cutting his kadayif. What's the news there? What news do you want? How is my dear Manuk? For he missed his dog more than anything. I'm sorry, my friend, but Manuk is dead. Are you telling me that Manuk is dead? The man asked because he couldn't believe it. Yes, my friend, he ate the meat of your mule and died. Does that mean the mule is dead? Yes, my friend, the mule died while hauling your father's gravestone. Are you trying to tell me, Haji Ovan, that my father is dead? Yes, he lived 2 weeks after your mother's death. She died of a broken heart when she heard how your brother died trying to save your sister. Are you telling me that my mother and brother and sister are dead? Why don't you just come out and say it? My family is all dead, my home ruined. I don't know if your home is ruined, Haji Ovan said, but when I left the village, the Turks were tilling the soil where your house once stood. It was one of those bizarre stories my grandmother came out with occasionally that left me bewildered and speechless. As I watched the sun glare off her dark glasses, I sat there in silence, picking at the nylon bands of the chaise lounge, until my mother appeared with a tray of watermelon and cheese, and everyone came out and started in on dessert, and I was relieved. Thank you. So, a couple of snippets to give you the feel for the memoir, and I open the floor to have conversation.
You told a story about this black dog in your book, and it's quite a weird story, but personally I didn't know, why did you choose this title for your book?
So, that was the question of the woman here in the front row as well. Why did I choose the title, the title that I chose in regard to the weird story that my grandmother tells about the black dog? Well, you know, as I mentioned to you earlier, one of the things that was so powerful for me as a child in the process of having the Armenian past transmitted to me was my grandmother's Western Armenian folkloric imagination, that she had a storehouse of folk tales and parables. Now, I didn't understand all these parables as a boy. They were sometimes scary, they were weird, they were interesting. And of course, a writer is if you grow up to be a writer, you're very happy that your grandmother told you weird parables and folk tales, because this is great stuff for literature, too. That story about the black dog, I don't want to try to explicate it here. I want you to explicate it and tell me what you all think it means. But it clearly comes out of a deep reservoir of Armenian Christian sensibility and imagination. And it deals with big cosmic issues, religious and spiritual issues, fate, time, the predicament of person A versus person B. You know, it's one of those wonderful universal tales. It has a lot of meaning, a lot of interesting, thought-provoking concepts. And I wanted the reader, to connect with I wanted the title to embody my grandmother's folkloric imagination, her Armenian imagination, which I think the Sev Shuna does, you know. And then I wanted the reader to take this as a symbolic and metaphoric ball of thread and pull the thread through the book and see how it might connect to things as we continue on the journey.
Yeah. My name is Nader Hawalla. I'm a second-year student in HAIGAZIAN. My question isn't related directly to your book, but it's related to the tragedy of the genocide in general. For the past decades, a lot of efforts have been spent by the Armenian community and the world communities to reach a recognition for the Armenian genocide by several countries, and especially by Turkey. Those efforts have paid off, and tens of countries now recognize the genocide. However, Turkey still does not. My question is, to what extent do you think dialogue between the Armenian and the Turkish communities can maybe pressure the Turkish government to finally recognize the genocide? To what extent do you think the dialogue between the people, the Armenians and the Turkish, in ways to share the facts, to exchange point of views, to see where conviction exists, where doesn't it exist, this dialogue, which I think might be productive, to what extent do you think this can pressure the government, the Turkish government, to finally recognize the genocide?
Right. A very good question. I mean, it forces me to reflect on the complexity of this moment politically between Turkey, the Armenian world, and the EU, because this is a moment of extraordinary drama in that dialogue. I'm sure many of you in this room are following that drama on the internet. You know, is probably the best place to follow it. But I'll summarize my own sense of the moment, because I am involved in a number of these conversations. The EU moment, the moment of Turkey's bid for EU accession talks, has catapulted, as you know, the Armenian genocide into a kind of high priority in the process. What I see happening in Turkey is a kind of schizophrenia. The government seems to be more hysterical and ludicrous than ever. The accusations against the Armenian people that Turkey, Ankara, is now making, the Turkish Prime Minister's call for an objective investigation into the fate of the Armenian people of 1915. This is just a cynical public relations gimmick. The government is behaving horribly. They're threatening to pass genocide resolutions against all the countries in Europe. And you know, almost every country in Europe has acknowledged the Armenian genocide. I mean, Great Britain is the one that stands out the most saliently here as having not. This behavior is really counterproductive for Turkey. However, because the Turkish government is under pressure to allow civil society to happen, we've never heard more Turkish voices come to the surface about the Armenian genocide. It's really astonishing and exciting to see. Not only the famous Turkish novelist Orhan Pamuk, but scholars, Hilal Berktay, you know, in Istanbul, Ademir, Gojek, Akçan, all of these people are speaking out. And in the Turkish newspaper, I guess I myself appeared in the Turkish Daily News twice a couple weeks ago. I mean, that's phenomenal, and not in a negative way, which is shocking. So there's a moment here in which the progressive people in Turkey are being allowed to come forward. I think this is a very promising thing. There are dialogues that are beginning to happen between the Armenian world and the Turkish world. I think that's good. But my other feeling is that the dialogues need not be about Armenians and Turks. We need the international community of scholars to be involved in this conversation, almost in a way more so, because for obvious reasons, they're going to carry even more weight with the people in the middle in Turkey. And so last month, the International Association of Genocide Scholars wrote a brilliant letter to the Turkish Prime Minister, underscoring the 50-year historical record of the Armenian genocide discourse, starting with Raphael Lemkin's very definition of genocide, which is bound up in the Armenian extermination, right on to scholarly books of the last decade. And I think this is a very positive thing, that we call on scholars in other cultures and other areas to be working with this dialogue for conflict resolution, if you will. And here in Lebanon, you know, scholars working in Arabic would be very important to this dialogue. And I know there's some out there, and personally I look forward to connecting with them. You're going to hear me talk more about this tomorrow. The Armenian genocide is a world event. It belongs to world history. It is, of course, a history that happened to the Armenian people, but its significance is so huge. And I think we need, as an intellectual and scholarly community, to bring that message to the broad contextualizing of the century's first genocide to the Turkish culture. So I think there's a light here. I think there's a little opening, and I hope this light can keep coming. And because I think if the Turkish government stopped its repression, its denial, its propaganda, its fear-mongering, its own people would come to see the truth fairly quickly. I mean, you're still going to have your right-wing nationalists, because they always exist, but you're going to have a lot of people really beginning to get this. So sorry for that long answer, but those are some reflections.
Tanya Wagimian. I'm completing my master's degree in HAIGAZIAN'S in clinical psychology. I have first to thank you and thank Dr. Ekmekci because I'm doing my thesis this year, and the whole story goes, the basic is what you are saying. I know that you are, after doing my research, I know that you are one of the few people who put the question about the psychological reason behind the silence of the Armenian people after the genocide. And I want to ask you, after you knew that you are an Armenian, after you had discovered this thing, did you ever ask your mom or your dad why they remained silent? And now that you know the answer, what is your explanation about it?
Okay. Let me first. I don't want to. Have you read Black Dog of Fate? Have you read my memoir? Yes. Okay. You know, for those of you who haven't read the book, I want to note this: that we grew up with a strong sense of being Armenian. I don't want there to be any ambiguity about that. I went to church I went to Badarak every Sunday. I got confirmed in the church. We had a huge extended family, and all of that. You know, we were proud of that. But when it came to history and politics, that's where there was silence. Just so I clarify that with you. My feeling, two answers to your question. Yes, I have talked with my parents. My father's been dead for 20 years, but I talked with both of them in the aftermath of these revelations about the past. And I certainly would not suggest that my family's pathology represents all Armenians. I know that's not true. It doesn't represent all Armenian Americans. There are families that spoke very intensely about this history very openly with their children. And then there were families like my family who didn't. And then there were probably families in the middle. So there's a spectrum of response here. But I think your question is a good one. And I do think, in a sense, the aftermath of the Armenian genocide was relegated to silence. And I'm going to speak about America now, because that's what I know the best, and you'll tell me if this is true about your experience here in Lebanon. Because there was no civic culture for human rights. It didn't exist in the world. It hadn't been invented yet. Raphael Lemkin didn't coin the word for genocide till 1944. And in the United States, we don't really get a human rights culture, and I think the US is one of the most progressive and leader cultures on this movement in our own popular culture than any culture in the world. We didn't come to a place of human rights culture until the mid to late 1960s. And there were several factors influencing that. First, the African American civil rights movement, which had a huge impact on American life. I think the new feminist movement of the 1960s, because of its insights about the importance of women and the idea of gender, the importance of gender as an analytical and political concept. The anti-Vietnam War movement, the popularization of psychotherapy. Before you can have survivors have a voice on a civic platform, a voice of moral authority, you do need to have some popular psychological affirmation that this is positive and good and valuable. And that really didn't happen until the decades following World War II. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, wasn't really a concept until the 1960s. I mean, it was a narrow concept among a few specialists. All these things become. And then also I would add the burgeoning Holocaust studies movement. This is starting in the late 60s, early 70s. This created a fertile arena in the US for witness, survivor experience, genocide studies. Now I want to tell you, in the United States, genocide studies is a hot curriculum. The Armenian genocide is taught a lot around the United States because of Holocaust studies and genocide studies. Holocaust studies has done fantastic things for the Armenian genocide. Jewish American scholars have been amazing to this discourse, and I can talk about that in more detail. But it was this change, this sea change in American culture that brought the Armenian genocide experience to a new public ground. And my grandmother died in 1964. She never lived into that moment. Now, had she lived into the 60s or 70s, late 60s, 70s, maybe she would have said, okay, there's a way I can connect what happened to me to something meaningful in the popular culture. I also think, and the other part of my answer to your question is, I think in the end, growing up in the United States in the post-war, World War II decades, people wanted to fit in. They wanted to be the same. They wanted to be Americans. And they also, I think in my parents' case, they didn't want to scare this was too heavy. They wanted to protect us. It was part of the American suburban milieu or ethos. So those are some reflections.
Hello, my name is Bersha Chan. I'm the Director General of the Ministry of Environment. Allow me first to thank you for your hypnotic intervention tonight. It's very interesting. And allow me to share with you the fact that your childhood is no different to many Armenians in this country. There used to be the outside world, which is Lebanese world,
Right.
the western stroke eastern world, and there was the inside world of the house, which was Armenian, like you described it in your family. For example,
Good to know.
we used to celebrate 2 Christmases in my family, 25th of December, because we need to get the presents before we go back to school, and back again on the 6th of January, which is our Christmas.
Right.
And allow me to share with you also a point of view about what you have said. You said that there's 3 countries that did not actually sign for the genocide actually happening in history.
Well, 3 major countries.
Major countries. You
Right.
said Germany, England, and United States. Now, we all know why Germany did not sign. Because they have a big under economy of Turkish workmen in Germany, and this will create a big problem for the Germans. We know for the last 25 years, the British are pro-American in their policies and general foreign policy.
Right.
So if we can get the Americans to sign,
Right.
then we can have a domino effect on other big countries to sign.
Right.
On another note as well, you spoke about the Turkish with their schizophrenic attitudes or schizophrenic approaches to the Armenian genocide. And here we go again, looking at the borders of Turkey. They have problems with Cyprus.
Right.
They have problems with Greece. They have problems with Bulgaria. They have problems with the Armenians. They have problems with the Kurds. They have problems with the Syrians. And they have problems with the Iraqis. I'm not sure if there's any other border they don't have problems on. And this is because perhaps they have what they have in their culture, which is conflicting with other cultures of the world. Now, my question to you is the following. I'm not sure if you heard, if you read Tom Hartman's book, which is The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, where Tom Hartman speaks about our addiction on TVs. Now, if you speak of cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, they're no more addictive than TVs. And TVs came into your memoir a number of times as scenes in your memoir. Now, people, unfortunately, these days don't read books. They watch TVs more than reading books for a number of reasons. Time, constraints, financial constraints, and so on. And to get our idea sort of trespassing through communities, we need to get this valuable book of yours more on the media and the TV. Is there anything we can do here in Lebanon to assist in that? We would be grateful to hear it from you. Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, I don't think I can respond to, I'm going to respond to your last question, I think, because it's the easiest. Black Dog of Fate had a great treatment by the media when it came out in 97, 98. I was on a lot of television shows and radio and so on. I think one of the things that makes me feel good 8 years later is that the book is being taught in the curriculum all over the United States. You know, that the book goes through a printing every 4, 5, 6 months. So that means it's crossed over into this kind of mainstream. The classroom is the bottom line. I mean, one of my messages here tonight and tomorrow night will be even more in depth, is that recognition will happen through education. When you educate everybody about the importance of this history, you're not going to have anybody who's afraid to acknowledge it, even in the face of Turkish pressure. I really believe that. I believe that education has that power for social change. One of the things that I am involved with in the United States is the curricular movement, in the movement to teach this history where it's appropriate in the big picture. And again, I don't want to jump the gun to tomorrow night's lecture, but I'm going to talk a lot about these issues tomorrow night in the way I frame my exploration of the burning Tigris. There is a lot of excitement about recovering this lost history in the U.S. curriculum. I can't tell you how much. Now, it doesn't mean that you can walk down the side streets of Des Moines, Iowa, and ask somebody if they know about the Armenian genocide and expect to get a perfect answer. But you can't imagine how many calls I get to lecture around the USA, and how many people are working with real passion, and not Armenians. I'm talking about the rest of America working to get the Armenian genocide in the curriculum. Let me mention a fantastic organization in the United States called Facing History and Ourselves. They're based in Boston. They have 6 offices around the United States. They are a moral education curricular development institution. They've been around for almost 40 years. They started as a Holocaust organization. It's mostly Jewish American based, and they have given their shirts off their back to the Armenian genocide now. They've just published a 200-page Armenian genocide reader for high school teachers, and it's brilliant. I mean, you should all get a copy. It'll blow your minds, as we say back home, to see how well other organizations are doing for our history. These people are working with tens of thousands of teachers every semester, every month almost, for this history, for our history, for the Armenian history. So, what can my question would be, can you find the right place for the Armenian genocide in the mainstream Lebanese school curriculum, on your standardized tests, in your O-levels or equivalent? You can't teach World War I without teaching the Armenian genocide. Doesn't matter what your curriculum is in what country. I'll tell you just as an aside, when my son, who now is a high school junior, last year he took his, in New York State, we have these exams that the state gives you every year, and he took his Regents test in world history, and he came home saying, well, you're going to like this one, Dad. Here was question 54. Which country committed genocide against which of its domestic minority populations in World War I? That tells you something. That question wasn't imaginable 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Now this is becoming part of the curriculum. We're just getting there. I don't mean to suggest we don't have, in the US, we have lots of work to do. If we worked on this 24 hours a day for the next 5 years, it wouldn't be enough. But the same thing I think you can do here, and I hope you do, because education will change world consciousness, and that's really at the root of everything else.
I'm Abdulkader Itani. I'm a graduate of HAIGAZIAN College in 1973, one of the oldest. And excuse my poor English, it's very old English. All right.
It's good, it's good. It's better than my Arabic.
And I thank very much HAIGAZIAN College for reminding me, or my community don't know about the Armenian genocide. Because I was enrolled in HAIGAZIAN College, I knew very much of this genocide, although the Turkish government denied this. But I just want to be short. Will this genocide rank as a state terrorism, right? As a research nowadays, they run in the media that there is kind of state terrorism, right? And will it bring any revenge on the Turkish government later on by other Armenian generations?
Would I classify genocide as state terrorism? Yes. I mean, generally speaking, I'd really need to think more about the definitions, but I mean, it is genocide, of course, is committed out of an absolute asymmetry of power, where a helpless, unarmed domestic minority population is at the mercy of a government and all of its institutional organs. So yes, I don't know if scholars have used the term state terror to talk about genocide, but you know, it's something to think about. Would this provoke revenge? I don't know what. From Turkey? I don't think so. No, I don't think it's possible for the Turkish government to respond in a violent way to the Armenian people, at least in the diaspora. You're right, Armenia is on its border, and one doesn't know, but one would hope it's going to go in the other direction, that the Turkish government is going to be brought to a place of conscience about its due, about its reparations. In Turkey, might it bring a backlash to Turkish Armenians? It's possible, but now with Turkey being under the EU watch for human rights, I think they're afraid to do that. So this EU moment is a very potentially positive moment to bring Turkey into some reign, some order, some accountability.
My name is Armin Harutunyan, and I am not a student. Yeah, I have two questions.
But you could be.
I was. First of all, there is a meeting from 25th to 27th May in Istanbul. And many scholars and professors all over from America, United States I mean, and all over from Europe, and some Armenians also will take place in this. They are 30 in number. This will take place in Istanbul, 25th, 27th May.
Right.
Do you think that this is also a gimmick, or and they will treat the position anti-governmental? Good. Second question is possible?
Do I think the conference coming up in May in Istanbul on the Armenian genocide is a gimmick? Is that your question?
Yes.
Yeah. You know,
it seems to be serious.
All I can say is one has to hope for the best and be prepared for the worst. You know, one can't be naive. We're too seasoned by history to be naive. But we don't want to be totally cynical. We want to allow a moment that could yield something positive to happen.
Yeah. And suppose that the Turks recognized Armenian genocide after 2 months, 2 years. What will be our action, our position?
Right.
What are we supposed to do?
Right.
Do we know? What are we going to do? Thank you.
Right. Well, it's a great question, and I think that the Armenian community needs to have some, perhaps, more organized way of talking about what our response to acknowledgement will be. I mean, we're a very complicated community worldwide. We have Hayastan, we have many diasporas, we have many groups within the diasporas and I think we need to develop some menus at least, choice A, choice B, and so forth. Obviously, you know, the Turkish government owes Armenia and the Armenian people reparations. What they will be, how that will happen, very complicated. I'm certainly not prepared to give you my menu A or B or C tonight, but I think the community needs to find an organized way of talking about this intelligently, and I think the community needs third parties to work with it, people who are working on these issues, international lawyers, conflict resolution people. We need people to be working together to make an intelligent plan to be prepared for that moment, which probably will happen someday.
My name is Silva Liberidian. I would like to know, are there any plans to translate your book into Turkish? Or has there been in any way, have you penetrated the Turkish societies? And for sure you've had some students, you told us that it's very popular on the curriculum in the States. What was the reaction of Turkish students or some Turkish nationals to your book?
Did you hear the question? Well, you know, I wasn't going to talk about it, but since you asked me the question, I think I should answer it honestly. My book is due out in Turkey in 3 days. Yeah. Now, I'm so superstitious, you know, maybe something will happen, but I worked with the translator very, very seriously, wonderful person. I think the German translator and the Turkish translator were the two most intense in their work with me on minute things. So the book is due out, they told me May 25. I can't guarantee it will be out on May 25, but it's very soon to come out. And let's see what, you know, obviously it's not going to be featured in their main bookstores in downtown Istanbul, but we're certainly not in downtown Erzurum. But I don't know, we'll see what happens. It's going to get some play in Turkey, and it's going to be interesting, and I can't wait to get my copies. That too is a sign of the times, perhaps. Obviously, I don't want to mention the publisher's name. You can probably figure out who the publisher is. He's a very brave man, and he's given his life to publishing controversial books in Turkey. Your second question was about Turkish people in the United States have not been generous to me or my work. They tend to be very hostile, the ones I've encountered, and they're coached by the Turkish embassy in the US. The students tend to be, they don't know anything about this history. And one thing I say to them is, you've been denied access to your own history. The Turkish students I've met on college campuses in the last month were full of their government's propaganda. They were polite, but they asked all the wrong questions, and the questions are the ones that you get from Ankara. And I had a chance to have a little conversation with them. Mostly I'm asking them to think about why it's important to be able to criticize your own culture. That this is the basis of democratic culture, that you can become critical, self-critical about your past. Look, in the United States, one of the greatest things we do is we critique American history all the time. We teach the history of slavery. We teach the U.S. treatment of Native Americans. It's the bottom line of the curriculum, and it's what makes America a great democracy, is that we are strong in this way. Our educational system is full of progressive self-critique. No society can call itself a democracy until it can do that. And the Turkish government has never allowed that process to exist. And I try to get the students to focus on that rather than on the history of 1915. They should start thinking about what it means to have critical self-analysis in your own country. If I can get them there, I feel I've done something positive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We would like to invite you all to Mugar Garden for a reception. There will be the books available. He will be signing the books.